The smell of mahogany and leather filled the law office as Michael stared in disbelief at the document before him. "You're telling me Uncle James left me the entire property? All 10 acres?" The attorney nodded, sliding the deed across the polished desk. At 35, Michael had been scraping by in his cramped city apartment, saving every penny from his construction management job. Now he owned a sprawling property with a cabin, workshop, and private fishing pond worth nearly 7 figures. The same property where he'd spent childhood summers catching fireflies and learning to fish from the uncle who just passed away unexpectedly. As Michael drove out to see his inheritance, he noticed how the once rural surroundings had transformed. Luxury homes with manicured lawns now bordered what his uncle had always called the middle of nowhere. Standing on the porch of the weathered cabin, cell phone buzzing with work messages he was ignoring, Michael ran his hand along the rough-hewn railing his uncle had crafted decades ago and made a decision that would later prove fateful. This property wasn't going on the market, no matter what developers might offer. The next day, Michael returned with a notebook and began cataloging everything that needed repair. The cabin roof sagged dangerously in one corner. Raccoons had claimed the workshop as their own, and the dock jutting into the pond looked one strong wind away from collapsing. As he walked the property line, he discovered something troubling. Several sections of the old wire fence were completely down, and in 3 spots, well-worn footpaths cut from the neighboring development onto his land. Near the pond, he found discarded soda cans, a child's plastic beach toy, and what appeared to be the remains of a weekend picnic. "Looks like the neighbors have been making themselves at home," he muttered, picking up trash that couldn't have been his uncle's. James had been fanatical about keeping his property pristine. Michael checked the property stakes against the survey map the attorney had provided. Sure enough, the pond and surrounding 50 yards were completely within his boundary lines. That evening, as sunset painted the water golden, Michael sat on the cabin steps with a beer, watching a family with 2 small children and a golden retriever stroll casually around his pond. They waved cheerfully at him, as if he were a fellow visitor to a public park. Michael raised his bottle in response, too tired after the day's assessment to confront them. Tomorrow would be soon enough to start establishing boundaries, both literal and figurative. Back in his apartment that night, Michael scrolled through local real estate listings. Homes in lakeside estates, the development bordering his property, were selling for $850,000 to $1.2 million, with marketing materials prominently featuring community green space with private pond access. Michael zoomed in on the photos and recognized his pond, his dock, and his wooded acres. His blood pressure spiked as he realized someone was using his inheritance as a selling point without his knowledge or permission. The question was, had his uncle allowed this arrangement, or had the developers and residents simply helped themselves to his land once the elderly man became too frail to monitor his property? The crack of Michael's hammer echoed across the property as dawn broke on his 4th consecutive weekend of renovations. His muscles ached from replacing rotted floorboards, and a deep gash on his forearm from clearing thorn bushes had barely healed. But seeing the cabin slowly transform was worth every blister and splinter. He left his uncle's faded, no trespassing signs in place, planning to update them once the major renovations were complete. Taking a break to gulp down water, he spotted a group of women in designer activewear power walking down his dirt access road. One waved cheerfully as if he were the groundskeeper rather than the owner. Throughout the day, he counted 11 different neighbors who used his property as if it were a public park, walking dogs along the pond edge, taking selfies on his dock, even setting up a portable easel to paint the community landscape. Michael, covered in sweat and sawdust, was frequently mistaken for hired help. Each time, he politely clarified that this was private property, receiving responses ranging from embarrassed apologies to dismissive glances. One woman even patted his arm condescendingly and said, "Well, I'm sure whoever owns this lovely place wouldn't mind us enjoying it too, would they?" Little did she know she was speaking to the owner himself. By his 6th weekend, Michael had replaced the cabin's roof and reinforced the sagging porch. His contractor friends had helped him haul away 3 dumpsters of debris, and the interior walls now gleamed with fresh paint. The security cameras he'd installed captured a steady stream of trespassers, morning joggers, couples on walks, teenagers sneaking beers by the pond after dark. The most egregious incident occurred when he arrived early one Saturday to find a professional photographer directing a family in matching outfits through a full portrait session on his dock. "Excuse me," Michael approached them, trying to keep his tone neutral despite his growing frustration. "This is private property." The photographer lowered his camera, looking annoyed at the interruption. "We've got permission from the HOA to use this location." "The HOA doesn't own this property," Michael replied. "I do, and I didn't give anyone permission for a photo shoot." The father, wearing a crisp white button-down that matched his wife and 3 children, stepped forward. "There must be some mistake. We paid the community access fee specifically for these photos." Michael's eyebrows shot up. "You paid a fee? To whom?" To the Lakeside Estates HOA, of course. They handled the scheduling for the pond area. The man pulled out his phone and showed Michael an official-looking receipt for $175 for premium community backdrop access, 2 hours. Michael took a photo of the receipt with his own phone. I'm afraid you've been misled. This is private property, not community land. The HOA had no right to charge you for access. Seeing the family's crestfallen expressions, he softened. Look, you can finish your session. You've already paid, just not to the right person. But please spread the word that this isn't HOA property. After they left, Michael called his attorney. This wasn't just casual trespassing anymore. Someone was profiting from his land. The attorney advised documenting everything and suggested they might have grounds for legal action against the HOA. Michael installed 4 more security cameras and ordered a stack of new, larger, private property signs. That evening, as he was staining the cabin's interior floors, a sharp knock interrupted his work. Opening the door, he found an impeccably dressed man in his 60s holding a folder of papers. Good evening, the man said with practiced smoothness. I'm Richard Pemberton, president of Deerfield Development. I understand you're the new owner of this property. He gestured at the cabin and surrounding land. I'd like to discuss a very generous offer to purchase these acres. We're planning Phase 3 of Lakeside Estates, and this parcel would be perfect for our luxury lakefront homes. Michael leaned against the doorframe, suddenly understanding why the HOA had been treating his land as community property. They'd been expecting it to be sold to developers all along. The roar of the circular saw died as Michael cut power, certain he'd heard someone shouting over the noise. Pushing up his safety goggles, he spotted a woman marching directly toward him with the determined stride of someone with a complaint. Her perfectly highlighted blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and a leashed white poodle trotting beside her. Most striking was the wicker picnic basket swinging from her arm as if she were headed to a designated park rather than someone's private property. Excuse me, she called sharply, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You're going to have to take that racket elsewhere. Several of us are trying to enjoy a ladies' brunch by the pond. Michael blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this is private property. You and your friends can't have a picnic here. The woman, who would soon become infamous in Michael's mind as Karen, actually laughed, a tinkling sound devoid of humor. Don't be ridiculous. This is the Lakeside Estates Community Green Space. I'm on the HOA board, so I think I would know. She looked him up and down, taking in his dusty work clothes and sweaty appearance. Now, if the owner hired you to do repairs, that's fine, but you'll need to work around our scheduled activities. We've had this brunch planned for weeks. Michael had turned down Pemberton's development offer the previous evening, making it clear the property wasn't for sale at any price. The developer had left with a tight smile and a business card, promising to circle back when you've had time to consider the market value. Now, less than 24 hours later, here was this woman acting as if she owned the place. Let me introduce myself, Michael said, setting down his saw. I'm Michael Thornton. I own this property. Karen's pencil eyebrows arched over her sunglasses. That's not possible. James Thornton owns this land. James was my uncle. He passed away and left me the property. Michael gestured to the cabin. I've been renovating for the past 6 weekends. Well, that's simply not true, Karen replied, her voice hardening. The community has an understanding with Mr. Thornton about usage rights. I've personally spoken with him. Michael felt a chill despite the warm day. His uncle had been dead for almost 4 months. Either she was lying or someone had been impersonating James Thornton. When exactly did you speak with my uncle? He pressed. Karen waved her manicured hand dismissively. That's hardly relevant. What matters is that you're disrupting a scheduled HOA event. We have 15 ladies waiting by the pond for our monthly book club brunch. Michael glanced toward the water, and sure enough, a group of women were arranging chairs and tables on his property, complete with tablecloths, champagne bottles, and what appeared to be catered food. How long has the HOA been scheduling events on this property? Michael asked, his contractor's mind quickly calculating the financial value of such usage. Since the development was built, of course, Karen said impatiently. It's in all our marketing materials. Exclusive access to pristine woodland and private pond. Now, if you'll excuse me. She attempted to step around him. Michael moved to block her path. I need to see documentation of this arrangement, because as the legal owner, I've never approved any events nor received any compensation for use of my property. Karen's pleasant facade cracked slightly. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not going to argue with a hired help. If you have concerns, have the actual owner contact our HOA management company. She pulled a business card from her pocket and thrust it at him. Michael took the card, noting the name embossed in gold script. Karen Wilkinson, President, Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. I'll be in touch, Ms. Wilkinson, he said, pocketing the card. But right now, I need you and your book club to leave my property. Karen's face flushed. I most certainly will not. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? My husband is a partner at Preston, Wilkinson and Thorne. If you continue harassing me, you'll be hearing from our attorneys. I'm not harassing you, Michael replied calmly. I'm informing you that you're trespassing on private property. Karen's poodle, sensing the tension, began to bark shrilly. Quiet, Bentley, she snapped, then refocused on Michael. You clearly don't understand how things work around here. We pay very high HOA fees for amenities, including use of this green space. If the ownership has changed, the HOA should have been notified. Michael crossed his arms. The ownership transfer was recorded with the county 4 months ago. Perhaps your HOA should have checked before continuing to use property you don't own or have permission to access. Let me be absolutely clear, Michael said, struggling to keep his voice level. This is not community property. This has been in my family for 30 years. Karen's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose above her sunglasses. Young man, I understand you're just doing your job, but don't lie to me. Everyone knows this land belongs to an elderly gentleman. I've personally seen the name on county records. She attempted to sidestep him, but Michael moved to block her path to the pond, where he could now see 4 other women unpacking food onto his dock. The elderly gentleman was my uncle, James Thornton. He passed away last year, and I inherited the property. I am Michael Thornton, the current owner. Karen's face flushed crimson. How dare you? First disrupting our gathering with your construction noise and now making up stories. Her voice rose to a pitch that made her poodle whine. If you were really the owner, you wouldn't be dressed like that. She gestured dismissively at his work clothes. Several curious neighbors who had been walking the perimeter path stopped to watch the confrontation. Michael pulled out his phone. We can resolve this easily. I can show you the deed right now. Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you threatening me with your phone? Ladies, she called to her friends. This worker is becoming aggressive. Before Michael could respond, she was already dialing on her own phone. Yes, hello, police? I need to report a threatening trespasser at the Lakeside Estates community pond. He's preventing residents from accessing community property and becoming belligerent. Please hurry. As Karen dramatically reported her emergency, Michael walked away from her toward the dock where the other women were now watching with concern. One, a younger woman with a kind face, approached him cautiously. Is everything okay? Karen seems pretty upset. No, everything is not okay, Michael replied, keeping his tone even. This is private property, my property. I inherited it from my uncle, James Thornton. Your HOA has no right to be hosting events here. The woman looked genuinely confused. But we've been told this is community green space. It's in all our HOA materials. Well, you've been missiled, Michael said, pulling up photos on his phone. Here's the deed with my name on it. Here's the property survey showing the boundaries. And here, he swiped to another image, is my uncle's will leaving this entire property to me. The woman examined the screen, her expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. We had no idea. She turned to the others. Ladies, I think we need to pack up. Don't you dare, Melissa. Karen's sharp voice cut across the dock as she marched toward them, phone still pressed to her ear. The police are on their way. This man is trespassing and making threats. Karen, Melissa said hesitantly, he has documentation showing he owns the property. I think we might be the ones trespassing. Nonsense. Karen snapped, though Michael noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross her face. The HOA has an arrangement with the owner. I am the owner, Michael repeated, and I have no arrangement with your HOA. Another woman from the group stepped forward, an elegant older lady with a southern accent. Karen, dear, perhaps we should reschedule until this matter is clarified. It would be terribly embarrassing if we were in the wrong. Karen's composure slipped further. Judith, after all the work we put into this brunch, the artisanal cheeses alone cost over $200. And the book discussion packets 40 minutes later, Michael was balancing on the cabin's roof ridge, hammering shingles and watching from his elevated position as a police cruiser navigated the dirt driveway. He couldn't help but smile grimly, having used the waiting time to gather every document proving his ownership, deed, property tax receipts, his uncle's will, and his driver's license, all neatly arranged on the porch table. Below, Karen was animatedly gesturing toward him, her brunch companions having long retreated back to the safety of their luxury homes. The shorter officer, whose nameplate read Rodriguez, called up to him. Sir, could you come down, please? Michael carefully descended the ladder as Karen's voice carried across the property. That's him, officer. He's been threatening us and claiming he owns our community space. Officer Rodriguez maintained a professional expression while his partner, Officer Bennett, moved toward Karen to take her statement. Michael extended his hand. Michael Thornton, officer. I understand there's confusion about this property. Karen interrupted. There's no confusion. He's lying. Check the county records. This has always been part of Lakeside Estates. Michael wordlessly handed over his stack of documents, which Officer Rodriguez began reviewing with methodical care. The moment stretched uncomfortably as Karen's certainty visibly wavered for the first time. Her friends exchanged glances, picnic forgotten as the realization dawned that they might be the ones trespassing after all. "Actually, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said after examining the documents, "according to these papers, Mr. Thornton does appear to be the legal owner of this property." Karen's jaw dropped. "That can't be right. Let me see those." She reached for the documents, but Officer Rodriguez kept them firmly in his grasp. "I verified his identification, and these appear to be legitimate legal documents," Rodriguez continued. "The deed is properly recorded with the county." Karen's indignation morphed quickly at calculation. "Well, there must be some kind of easement or agreement then. Our HOA has been using this space for years." Michael shook his head. "If there was, it would have transferred with the property, and I would have been informed during the inheritance process. My attorney found no such agreements." Officer Bennett, who had been quietly observing, asked Karen, "Do you have any documentation showing your HOA's right to use this property? A contract, perhaps, or receipts for payment to the owner for access rights?" Karen's poodle, sensing her distress, began circling her legs anxiously. "I don't personally carry HOA legal documents with me to a book club brunch," she snapped. "But they exist. The previous owner granted us access." "The previous owner was my uncle," Michael explained to the officers, "and I've been handling his affairs since his death. There's no record of any agreement with Lakeside Estates." Rodriguez nodded. "Ma'am, without documentation, it appears you're on private property without the owner's permission. Mr. Thornton has the right to ask you to leave." Karen's face cycled through emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and finally an odd smile that made Michael uneasy. "Officer," she said, her voice suddenly honey-sweet, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. You see, Mr. Thornton here approached our gathering very aggressively. He was waving tools around." "Mr. Thornton," Officer Rodriguez said finally, "everything appears to be in order. This property is indeed privately owned by you." The confirmation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Karen's face cycled through expressions: disbelief, confusion, embarrassment, and finally, doubling down with indignation. "That can't possibly be right. We've been using this pond for months. The HOA has even discussed installing benches." Michael crossed his arms. "Without consulting the owner, apparently." Officer Rodriguez turned to Karen. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification, please." Karen's hand flew to her chest. "Me? I'm the victim here." The officer's tone remained professional but cooled considerably. "You're currently standing on private property without the owner's permission after he's asked you to leave. That's trespassing." The other women began edging toward the path, suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. Karen's composure cracked entirely. "This is outrageous. We were told when we bought our homes that this was community property. Someone is lying, and it's not me." Her voice rose to a shriek as she pointed dramatically at Michael. "Officer, arrest that man. He's the one who doesn't belong here. Look at him. He looks like the hired help, not a property owner." A deadly silence followed her words, broken only by Officer Bennett's quiet intake of breath at the naked prejudice. Both officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening at Karen's outburst. Melissa, who had remained nearby, looked mortified. "Ms. Wilkinson," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice now cold, "I need to see your identification. Now." Karen fumbled in her designer handbag, her hands shaking with rage as she produced her driver's license. Officer Rodriguez examined it carefully and spoke into his radio, requesting a background check. His standard procedures seemed to horrify Karen. "What are you doing? I'm a respected community leader, not some criminal." "Just following protocol, ma'am," Rodriguez replied evenly. While they waited, Officer Bennett approached Michael. "Sir, I'd like to understand the history here. How long has this issue been going on?" Michael explained the situation: inheriting the property, discovering the trespassing, learning that the HOA had been misrepresenting his land as community space, even finding out they'd been charging residents for premium access for photo shoots. Bennett whistled softly. "That could constitute fraud. Have you contacted a lawyer?" "I have," Michael confirmed, "but I've been hoping to resolve this without litigation." Karen, overhearing this, became increasingly agitated. "This is absurd. The HOA has documentation. We've been paying property taxes on this green space for years."